The first winter was,
Give it a second here. Let's see. So we're at the first winter.
yeah.
Okay.
The first winter, of course, was the winter of 1940 and 41, and we spent the winter in tents, and of course times had been tough when we went in, and so I bought a steam iron and would press shirts, pants, and blouses for the fellows in the company, and charge them a small stipend of 10 or 15 cents, 10 cents for the trousers and 15 cents for the shirt or jacket, and I could make 75 cents an hour very easily when normal wages had been 30 cents an hour when I went in, and so I thought I was doing pretty good, and the company gave me space along with the barber to a tent that we operated out of in the evenings, and we did it on our own. He cut hair and I pressed clothing, and we did that throughout the winter, and then in the early summer of 1941, why we went to California on maneuvers, and they had big military maneuvers, and of course it was a test of moving large amount of troops distance, and so we spent a couple of months in the summer at San Luis Obispo, California, near Fort Ord, and in training and living in the field. We came back probably in August, and of course that meant I had my 20th birthday in California on maneuvers, and we came back by trucks, and I can remember how green and beautiful Oregon looked when we hit Ashland and came out of the Siskiyous. So by that time they had barracks built for us at Fort Lewis, or they were in the process of building them. I don't remember exactly when we did get into the barracks, but we moved over to some barracks that were built, and I think it was probably late 41, and pretty well, and so we spent the winter of 41, 42 in newly built barracks at Fort Lewis and training. And of course we were supposed to get out at the end of the year. That was, the National Guard was mobilized for a year, but then they extended the time because of the situation in Europe and Asia, as far as other countries and warring nations were concerned. They were afraid to let us out, and so there was quite a movement of Ohio, which was over the hill in October, because we were mobilized in September, and they wanted to respond, but nothing was ever really done because everybody realized the situation, and so we got into early 42, and by that time I had made corporal, and of course that was the hardest promotion I ever got, because you were competing against 100 or so other guys for 2 stripes, and when you went on up, when I made sergeant, you only had 20 or so that you were competing against, and so that was a start up the ladder. In the spring of 1942, the division was sent to Australia, and so we left San Francisco on the 22nd of April of 1942, and I had a number of the fellas, they had changed the requirements for, it used to be you had to have 2 years of college to get in the Air Force and pilot training, and they dropped it down to anybody with high school education could get into pilot training. And so I put in for the Air Force along with some of the other fellows, including Peck Love from Forest Grove, and I had trouble getting my birth certificate, so I got my transfer to the Air Force effective the 27th of April, but on the 22nd I was looking up at the Golden Gate Bridge heading west, and so I never made it into the Air Force. On the way over to Australia, I made sergeant, and so became section sergeant for the mortar section in an infantry line company. And so we got to Australia. It took us, I think, 22 days, and so we were it was middle of May by the time we got to Australia. And I can remember looking over and listening to the longshoremen talking in Australian. You could hardly understand their English. At Australia, we went into an army area probably 60 miles north of Melbourne, and we set up tents and drilled out of that area. We had several months in Melbourne, and it was a nice city to go and visit, and we were 60 miles, but you got every other weekend off, and so you could go in on Saturday and come back on Sunday, and we rode the train in. Then in probably the late fall of '42, we boarded the Australian trains, and it was quite an experience because we were going north and going up near Brisbane, and that's up the east coast of Australia. Two states. Victoria was the first state that Melbourne was in, and then New South Wales, and then Brisbane was in another state, and each state in Australia had a different gauge railroad, so the train would pull up to a loading dock, and you'd just load everything over onto the new train and go on. And so we had to do that twice to change train because the wheel difference was not standard. And so we had an interesting trip because it was going several hundred miles, quite a few hundred miles up to Brisbane. We lived in tents at Brisbane and drilled out of there, and had quite intensive training. And then right after Christmas, we spent Christmas Day at Yeppoon over on the east coast of Brisbane. We were probably 25 miles from the coast, and we used to go there on weekends. But I remember spending the week over at Yeppoon area training and doing some maneuvers there, and celebrating Christmas. And then we loaded on just every ship they could get, and they took us to New Guinea. And New Guinea at that time was just the Allied forces just held the Port Moresby area where they had airfields, and we staged out of there. And the 162nd Infantry Regiment was ahead of us, and part of the 41st Division, and they went into combat at Boona, and at least three of the Forest Grove fellows, Brooks Taylor, Bob Brown, and Raymond Strong, were killed in that action. And they flew us over the Owen Stanley Mountains, which were about 12,000 feet high, in an old DC-3 with no, just bare on the inside. We just laid down on our packs, and when we got over onto the other side of the hill around the Boona area where the action had been and where the fellows were killed, they had an Australian division and an American division, and we were relieving the 32nd Division, American division, and they had over 10,000 troops, probably 10,000 troops in each of two divisions, plus the Air Force and so forth. And they had no roads and 10 jeeps for 20, it was probably 20 to 25,000 men over there. And so it was really a very different thing to go into an area, and everywhere you went it was by foot, and everything was done. And they did lay some coconut logs in some of the mud holes, and would build a corduroy road to get through, but it was pretty primitive. Uh, we did some patrolling out of that area, but we really didn't see any action as far as direct contact with the Japanese. They were in the area, but we lucked out on that, even though we got credit for 2 campaigns in that area. The food was situations was pretty tough, and we had no fresh food for that. And so in August of no, I guess it was probably in July, after about 6 months up there, why the division was sent back to Australia for because there was so much sickness and stuff due to the lack of a good diet. When we were back in Australia, they asked if I would be interested in going to officers candidate school in Brisbane that they had set up there, and it was a 90-day program, and so I said probably I would. Was by that time I was platoon sergeant of the weapons platoon, which was machine guns and mortars for the company. And so I thought, well, I couldn't get any worse off than being in an infantry line company in the division. And so Pete Egoscue from Forest Grove and I went down to the candidate school together and went through it, and we were commissioned on I think about the 4th day of January of 1944. And they gave us a week for R&R, and you go anywhere you could get transportation to, and we chose to go to Sydney because that was the biggest city, and so we spent a week in Sydney and came back and were assigned to the 1st Cavalry Division. The 1st Cavalry Division was a regular Army outfit that had been stationed at Fort Bliss, Texas, for a number of years, and they were the last cavalry unit to have horses, and they had their horses in 1941 and into 42, but they took their horses and made them a regular infantry line company. So I didn't gain anything by going to the OCS, but actually raised in rank. And so 3 days after we got into the 1st Cavalry Division, why we loaded on ships and went to New Guinea, and then went right out to the Admiralty Islands, and we went right into combat on the Admiralty Islands. There they had established a beachhead in one place, and we went right through an area where they had been through several hundred Japanese had made a vicious counterattack and failed, and so there was dead, bloated bodies by the dozens there that we went through, and we went on, and then we our first combat was actually to go across a little peninsula and take another piece of land over there, and they sent some of the amphibian tracked vehicles up to us, and so we went in on those, and of course I think they sent 5 or 6, and a couple of them broke down on the way, and by the time we actually hit the water and crossed this bay, we were down to 2, and after one trip over there we were down to 1, and of course, fortunately, it was not a wide bay, and so we were able to make enough trips to get the whole battalion over there. And they were Japanese, and we there, and we lost some fellas, the first ones that afternoon in taking that peninsula. And I remember 2 days later, while we were still there, we were holding position. We just got the peninsula, and being a junior officer, why I got the task assigned to get rid of the dead Japanese that we had killed in that area. And so there was an old English boat there, and we would roll the bodies into a poncho and take them over and put them in the bay. And then when we got and tie a vine around it, the poncho to hold the body in, and when we get 8 or 10 of them there, why we'd have a rope, and we'd row out into the bay and unhook and come back and get some more. And so we got rid of about 40 some bodies on that task that afternoon. We lost one of the officers, was killed by a sniper that first afternoon, and we lost several other fellows. Of course, I've been there such a short time, I didn't know the fellows personally. But the next day, where we were going to move up the coast a bit, and we ran into some Japanese, and the captain had the officers up there, and we were looking at the map he had and planning on what our offense would be, and they dropped a mortar in on us and wounded the other officers, and so they all were evacuated to somewhere, and I was the only officer, so they put a new captain in from battalion headquarters, took over the company. We moved on up the coast, and then kind of set up an area and started patrolling out of it, and we'd send out a platoon-sized patrol, and that would be around 40 men or so. And this new captain, he thought an officer should accompany every patrol, so I'd get to go out with the first platoon one day, and the second platoon the next day, and the third platoon the next day. And after about a week of that, I was ready to turn in, and so he backed off of that. We backed off of the patrolling a bit, and we had a few more escapades on the Admiralty Islands, and then finally they were declared taken, and there was just a few stragglers left around, which were gradually picked up. But they moved an air base in there, and they made an airstrip, is what they were after, in Los Negros in the Admiralty Islands. And it wasn't too long they moved Air Force people, because they were flying missions to bomb Rabaul and some of the places up toward the Philippine Islands. And Peck Love was who I put in the Air Force together and was a member of Company I when we mobilized, was a pilot over there, and so we would, and Pete Egoscue was assigned to the adjoining company. So actually, when we were patrolling and so forth, why, we'd see each other off when it was his day or to go, or my day, and check in the evening to see if we got by all day. And it was kind of a comfort to have somebody that you at least knew, you see, and everybody else was strangers. But after the action was over, and we settled into tents and training again, Peck Love was there, and so we'd go over to the Air Force Base and eat a good meal every once in a while. And then Wayne Kuykendall, whom I'd gone to high school with, was a Navy officer by that time, and he was stationed there. And so it was rather a coincidental thing that the four of us from the Forest Grove and Yamhill areas would be on this little island that was 1 by 3 miles in 1 mile wide and 3 miles long, would be there. And so we visited back and forth several times. The next step we took was to go into the Philippines, and we were one of the assault divisions, and the assault right down to the assault company, and so we waded ashore in the Leyte area of the Philippines, and later I was to learn that Leyte was a small base there, that when General MacArthur got out of West Point, his first assignment was to Leyte, and so that's nostalgia that he wanted to go into that place. And I wondered, because the Philippines constitutes about 700 islands there. So we went into Leyte, and very fortunately there was no resistance in our area of assault. We just waded ashore and with all our equipment, and then gathered and went toward Leyte. It's the town of Tacloban in Leyte, and of course there were no Japanese there, and so then our assignment was to head up into the mountains, and of course late that afternoon, we ran into the Japanese, and one of the fellows that got shot in the abdomen, and he was critical, and he laid there, and so they had a machine gun covering him, and so we had difficulty in getting him out, and when we finally were able to get to him and pull him back, he had his pocket knife out, that he wasn't going to let the Japanese take him. He would kill himself before that. And that night he died of his wounds, because there was no evacuation facilities or anything. And so the next morning, we started on up a ridge toward the high ground, and of course there were Japanese in the area, and so we had a few confrontations, and went on, and anyway, it was kind of rainy. This was in October of '44, you see, and it was kind of rainy, and the mud would just get on your clothes, and we had our nose bumped up against the Japanese from the 20th of October until Christmas, and it was just one minor confrontation after another. Is they were trying to hold the high ground, we were trying to get it, and so we had a number of little escapades. I remember very vividly the Japanese were great for performing a banzai attack, and a banzai attack was where they would have a synchronized time of taking off, and they'd try and overrun you, and they would do psychologically. They had hand crank sirens, and they'd start out with yelling and then these sirens, and then they'd come forth with their charge. Well, the first night they did that, I make no bones about it, I urinated in my pants. I mean, you were scared like everybody else, and we were able to fend off the attack, and so what we would do every night, if we moved forward, we would set up a perimeter so that they couldn't attack us from any angle. You'd set up a circle, like the circle of wagon trains in the west, heading west, and we would do that, and then dig in, and you'd try and dig in so they couldn't set a machine gun up and traverse fire and hit anybody. You'd be below ground, you see, and that was your only protection, really. we ended up just before Christmas. The Japanese back was broken to get into the over the mountains into the Ormoc Valley, and that was where we were. During that period of time, we would scrape our pant legs off every night with a knife because they were so full of mud, and then you'd turn them inside and scrape the inside so they could kind of dry out a little bit. And I had shoes wore out on me, and so I hiked back a couple of miles and to get a new pair of shoes. And of course, when I got there, why, they gave me a pair of socks, and so I had dry feet for the first time since the 20th of October, and dry shoes, and of course they also had fresh eggs, and so I had a meal of scrambled eggs, and that was the only hot meal really we had in those 2+ months. After their back was broken, the Japanese, why, we sent out patrols, and they would find the Japanese hiding under houses, and some of them that would be sick would be in trying to cook them a little rice, and the first day we sent a patrol out, and like I say, this was about the 20th of December, and the patrol maybe ran onto 11 stragglers, and of course killed them, and you didn't try and take any prisoners. You just, that was, by that time we were seasoned, and there was just no reason to take prisoners. And so then the next day, why, the second platoon went out, and of course they got 2 more than the first platoon got that first day, and and they virtually hardly had a shot fired at them, and so that was so different than it had been those previous 2 months when they were sniping at you all the time, that the fellas kind of enjoyed that, and so it kept going, and we patrolled out there for about a week, and every day, why, they got a couple more than they had the day before, and so the fellas really had a little sunshine out of the cloudy time we'd had on Leyte. We had then we moved on right away and went up to Luzon, which was the main island in the Philippines, and we took over another outfit's position, and they had already established the beachhead, and so we took over their position, and then we started heading down the Lingayen Plains toward Manila. Manila being the queen city of the Philippines and the capital and everything. And the 1st Cavalry Division was staffed by West Pointers. And the West Pointers had virtually all of the field grade positions. Majors, lieutenant colonels, and generals were all West Pointers. And of course, those gentlemen wanted to write history. And so, you know, the way to write history is like Patton used to do, is he'd push and push and push, and if he was lucky, he made it. And so we pushed and left ourselves greatly exposed on the flanks, you know, but we got by with it and headed for Manila. And the night we were on the outskirts of Manila, why, the Japanese torched the city, and so great sections of the commercial section of Manila burned, and of course the flames were, we were probably 16 miles out of Manila, and you could just see the flames shooting skyward, and you knew that they were burning, and anyway, the next day we were there, and Manila was tough, and my company's assignment was to take the Manila Stadium, and of course the Japanese were set that up as a strong point because it was a solid concrete building, And as we went to the edge of the building, why they were on the rooftops and they would throw Molotov cocktails, which is a bottle of gasoline with a wick in it, and throw it down on you and they try and get fire started. And so we spent a day and a half trying to get in there, and we were just a block away, but we couldn't get that last block and get in there. And so the colonel came over and was gonna.
Where were we?
The colonel came down and was gonna show me how to take the stadium, and so we, if I remember right, why we had a couple of tanks and they fired on the stadium for a while, and then a few shells, and then we moved forward. And of course, we got inside the building itself, and we started. Some of the fellows the lead men started down the hallway and came to a place where it turns, and of course the Japanese were there waiting, and he just was very fortunate he didn't get his ass shot off because they just fired right down the hallway at right angles, and he was able to jump back and didn't get wounded. But we were that avenue was blocked to get any further, and we found pretty much the same in the other direction that they were there, and then we were in kind of a little ante room just off of the entryway there, and we're talking, and we got quiet, and we heard the Japanese in the next room right through the wall, and they were talking, and so they had apparently heard us, and so they started firing at us through the wall, and they shot the colonel in the testicles and his orderly in the earlobe, and then they decided we should pull back, and we did, and then really brought up some more tanks and really knocked. What I found out, I really didn't know this, that in 1995, the July or the April or May edition of the American Legion had a picture of the camp and an article about the 1st Cavalry Division racing down the Lingayen Plains to Manila to liberate the prison camp before the Japanese could get the prisoners out and hold them for hostage or anything like that. Should we